My neighbor Frank used to say that getting old was just a long list of things you couldn't do anymore. Every time I saw him, he had a new item on that list. Can't drive at night. Can't open jars without the rubber grip. Can't remember where he put the car keys he can't use at night anyway. Frank was 74 when he said those things. He died at 78. And I don't mean he died of something catastrophic. He just wore down, piece by piece, year by year, until there wasn't enough of him left to keep going. I think about Frank a lot when I sit down to write these things, not because I'm morbid about it, but because I was heading down the same road and I didn't know it until someone held up a mirror. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 81 years old. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, where the summers will cook you like a brisket if you're not careful, and where I walk 2 miles every morning before the heat has a chance to object. 3 years ago, I couldn't do that walk without stopping twice and wondering if I'd made a mistake leaving the house. My blood pressure was reading numbers I won't repeat here because I don't want to alarm anyone. My sleep was shallow and broken. I was forgetting things, small things mostly. A name here, an appointment there, but the pattern was clear, and patterns like that don't reverse themselves on goodwill alone. I'm not a doctor. I've never pretended to be. What I spent decades doing was working in community health education, which means I learned how to translate the language of medicine into something a working person could actually use. I've been doing that my whole career. And now I'm doing it for you, from the perspective of someone who is living exactly what you're living, or what you'll be living if you're not there already. This morning, before I poured my coffee, before I checked the weather, before I did anything else, I did what I've been doing every morning for going on 3 years. I ate a small amount of fenugreek, a teaspoon of seeds soaked overnight in water sitting on my kitchen counter. I drained the water into a glass, chewed the seeds, drank the water, and went about my day. That's it. That is the entire production. I know that sounds underwhelming. And I understand completely if your first reaction is skepticism, because that was my first reaction too. The reason I want to talk about this today is not because I think fenugreek is magic. I am 81 years old, and I have seen enough infomercials and supplement catalogs and miracle cure pamphlets to last several lifetimes. I have zero interest in adding to that noise. What I want to do is tell you exactly what happened to me, why it happened, and what the science behind it actually says in plain language, so you can make an informed decision for yourself. Because 3 months ago, I had a routine brain scan. My son Daniel, who's a physical therapist in Denver, has been gently nudging me toward more consistent monitoring since I turned 80. He's not alarmist about it. He's methodical. That's just how he was raised. The results of that scan came back in a way that surprised my doctor. The word he used was remarkable. He said the markers of inflammatory activity he'd expect to see in someone my age were significantly lower than what the scan predicted. He asked me what I'd changed. I told him about the fenugreek water. He raised an eyebrow. He wrote something down. He said, "Keep doing whatever you're doing." Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you that fenugreek cured anything or reversed anything or performed any kind of miracle. I'm telling you what my doctor said, and I'm telling you what I've noticed in my own body, and I'm going to walk you through the science as I understand it, which is the science that my son Daniel explained to me, and that I've spent considerable time reading about on my own since then. The reason I started this whole thing was not fenugreek, not at first. It started with a conversation I had with my daughter Laura. She's a registered nurse in Phoenix, and she was visiting on a Sunday afternoon about 3.5 years ago. We were sitting in the kitchen, and I was complaining, which I don't do often, but I was having a bad stretch, about how foggy I'd been feeling in the mornings. Slow to start, slow to think, slow to remember. She listened without interrupting, which is something she learned from her mother. When I finished, she didn't say what I expected her to say. She didn't recommend a supplement or a specialist or a new blood test. She asked me a question. She asked me what I was eating for breakfast. I told her. Toast mostly, sometimes eggs, coffee always. She nodded, and then she said, "Dad, your blood sugar is probably spiking and crashing before you finish your first cup." And if that's happening every morning, your brain is working in a fog all day because it never gets a stable fuel supply. I'll be honest, I thought she was oversimplifying. But I trust Laura, so I went home and I started reading. I spent about 2 weeks going through everything I could find on blood sugar regulation, cognitive function, and inflammation in older adults. And somewhere in the middle of all that reading, I found something that stopped me. A substance naturally occurring in fenugreek seeds called 4-hydroxyisoleucine has been studied for its effect on insulin response. In plain terms, it appears to help cells respond more efficiently to insulin, which means blood sugar stabilizes more gradually instead of lurching up and crashing down. For someone my age with the kind of foggy mornings I was describing, that mechanism mattered. I want to pause on that for a second because I know how this sounds. 81 years old, and I'm sitting up at midnight reading biochemistry papers like I'm back in school. But here's what I've learned in 8 decades of living. The people who survive well are the ones who never stop asking why. Not who, not where, not when. Why? Why does the body do this? Why does this ingredient affect that process? Why does it matter? I called Daniel the next morning and read him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's actually consistent with what I've read." He mentioned that the fiber content in fenugreek, specifically a soluble fiber called galactomannan, also slows digestion in a way that smooths out glucose absorption. Less spike, less crash, more stable fuel for the brain all morning long. I bought a bag of fenugreek seeds the following Tuesday. They cost me $4 and some change at a health food store on the north side of Scottsdale. I've been buying the same bag, more or less, ever since. The preparation is simple, and I want to give you the specifics because they matter. Before you go to bed tonight, take 1 teaspoon of fenugreek seeds, about 5 grams, put them in a clean glass with roughly 8 ounces of water, room temperature, not hot. Cover the glass with a small cloth or a plate, set it on your counter, and go to sleep. In 8 to 10 hours, the seeds will have swelled, and the water will have taken on a slightly yellowish tint. That color change is not a problem. It is the extraction working. The compounds in the seed need time and cool water to release fully. If you use hot water, you degrade them. If you rush the soak to 2 or 3 hours, you lose half of what makes it worth doing. In the morning, drink the water. Chew the seeds if you're willing, or strain them out if you're not. I chew them. They have a mild, slightly bitter taste that I've grown used to. Do this before breakfast on an empty stomach. That's the whole method. It takes about 45 seconds the night before, and another 30 seconds in the morning. There is no complicated protocol here, no measuring equipment, no subscription service, just seeds, water, and consistency. Now let me tell you what I noticed, and I want to be precise about the timeline because I have a tendency to distrust people who say something changed overnight. In the first week, I noticed nothing in particular. Maybe the seeds were doing something internal that I wasn't registering. That's fine. I kept going. By the end of the second week, my mornings felt less labored. That's the only word I have for it. Not dramatically energized. Not transformed. Just less of that slow, grinding start that had been my daily experience for the better part of 2 years. By the end of the first month, I slept through more nights than I hadn't. The broken sleep, the waking at 3 in the morning and lying there for an hour waiting to drift back, started becoming the exception rather than the rule. I have some reason to believe this connects to blood sugar stability as well, because that 3 a.m. waking is often described in the literature as a cortisol response to a blood sugar dip during sleep. When glucose stays more stable through the night, the body doesn't send that distress signal as often. By month 3, I mentioned all of this to Daniel on a call. He said, "Dad, there's also research on fenugreek and inflammation, not dramatic inflammation. The low-grade, chronic, systemic kind that accumulates over decades and starts degrading tissue. Joints, arterial walls. Brain tissue, the kind you don't feel as pain, just as a slow dulling of everything." He told me to look up steroidal saponins, which are compounds in fenugreek that have been studied for anti-inflammatory effects. So I did. And what I found, written in language considerably more complicated than I prefer, was consistent with what Daniel described. These compounds appear to interfere with certain inflammatory pathways in the body, not as dramatically as pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories, and without the side effects on the stomach and kidneys that come with long-term use of those medications. Slowly, gently, the way water wears down a stone rather than a hammer breaking it. I thought about my father when I read that. He worked a factory floor in Columbus for 37 years. Hard physical labor. By the time he was in his 60s, his joints were in bad shape, and he managed that pain the way men of his generation managed everything, by ignoring it until it became impossible to ignore, and then by taking what the doctor gave him. He took those medications for years. They helped the pain. They also damaged his kidneys. By 71, the kidney damage was the bigger problem. He died at 73. I don't know if fenugreek would have changed anything for my father. The world he lived in didn't offer much room for that kind of experimentation. But I think about the difference between aggressive symptom management and quiet, sustained support for the body's own systems. My father got the former because that's what was available to him. I've spent the last 3 years trying to give myself the latter. And the results, at least by the measure of that brain scan, and by the measure of how I feel walking those 2 miles every morning, suggest that it is not nothing. There's something else I want to mention, and this one surprised me. About 6 months into the fenugreek routine, I had my blood pressure checked at a routine appointment. The reading was lower than it had been in 4 years. Not by a small amount, by a number that prompted my doctor to review my medication dosage. He reduced it. I want to be very clear. I did not stop my medication. I did not reduce it on my own. My doctor made that call based on consistent readings over 3 separate appointments. If you are on blood pressure medication, you do not make changes to that without your doctor's involvement, full stop. I am telling you what happened in my case because I think it's relevant information, not because I am suggesting a course of action for anyone else. But I believe the fenugreek contributed to that result. The evidence I found when I went looking points to the seeds having a mild diuretic effect and containing compounds that support vascular relaxation. The blood vessels relax a little, the pressure drops a little. Over months of consistent use, that small daily reduction can show up in meaningful ways on a blood pressure cuff. I'm going to be honest about something else, too. When I first told my doctor I was soaking fenugreek seeds every morning, he looked at me the way doctors look at patients who start sentences with "my neighbor told me about." That polite, patient expression that says I'm listening, but I'm not adjusting my priors. It was only after the scan results and after he'd done his own reading that the conversation changed. He told me there was a reasonable body of evidence and that he saw no reason for me to stop. That's not a ringing endorsement, and I'm not presenting it as one. What it is a doctor who started from skepticism, looked at the evidence, and concluded that the practice was not harmful and likely supportive. For an 81-year-old managing his health with the tools available to him, that's a reasonable outcome. If you are considering adding fenugreek to your mornings, there are a few things I'd want you to know going in. It is not appropriate for everyone. If you are on blood thinners or on diabetes medication or managing a thyroid condition, you need to talk to your doctor before you start, because fenugreek can interact with those conditions in ways that require monitoring. That is not a warning I throw out casually. That is something I learned from Laura, who made me promise I'd always include it when I talk about this publicly. The other thing is consistency. I cannot stress this enough. A teaspoon of seeds soaked for one night and drunk on a Tuesday is not going to tell you anything. You are looking at a minimum of 6 weeks of daily practice before you can reasonably evaluate whether your body is responding. The body is slow. It does not make decisions quickly. Inflammation does not build overnight, and it does not resolve overnight. If you're not willing to commit to 60 days of doing this every single morning without interruption, then you are not ready to evaluate this practice fairly. 60 days is not much. I've been doing it for over 3 years. What I'd give to have started 10 years earlier, I can't put a number on. Margaret used to say that the most powerful thing a person could do for their health was show up for themselves quietly and consistently, without waiting for a crisis to make the decision for them. She was talking about something else entirely when she said it. But I think about those words every morning when I set out that glass on the counter before I go to bed. Quiet. Consistent. Before the crisis. If you're over 60, you know what I'm talking about. You've watched people around you begin to lose things. Mobility, sharpness, independence. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you've asked yourself whether that's inevitable, or whether there's something that can be done on the slow, quiet end of the process before any single system gets to the point of failure. That question is worth taking seriously. It is the question I've been living with for the last several years, and it is the reason I get up early enough every morning to do that walk before the Arizona heat decides otherwise. I'm not promising you anything. I wouldn't insult you that way. What I'm telling you is that a $4 bag of seeds, soaked overnight in a glass of water, has been part of a pattern that left my doctor describing my brain scan results with a word he doesn't use often. And at 81 years old, I'll take that word and hold on to it. You still have time to make the small decisions that add up to something. That's not optimism. That's arithmetic. I'll see you next week.